China is placing energy security at the center of its new 5-year energy blueprint. China is also encouraging industries to shift westward to tap resource-rich regions. Recently launched project highlights Beijing's push to make new energy the backbone of future capacity.
For 100 years, whoever controlled oil controlled the world. That might be ending, quietly, right now. And China is at the center of it. It's turning air into jet fuel, freezing air into a power plant, and running cargo ships on a chemical you'd normally find under your sink, all while a fusion reactor just broke a decades-old record. None of it made front-page news. All of it is connected. Let's dig into these things in this video and figure out what happens to global power once energy stops needing oil, ships, or a single vulnerable strait to get where it's going. The crack in the foundation. China builds an enormous share of the physical world. Phones, appliances, cars, machine parts. Walk into almost any store on the planet and there's a decent chance something in your hands passed through a Chinese factory at some point. All of that manufacturing runs on energy, and a huge slice of that energy still comes from oil. Roughly 7 out of every 10 barrels China burns are imported, shipped in from the Middle East, from Africa, from Russia. On its own, that's just a big number. The real issue is what has to happen for that oil to arrive at all.
Russian oil tanker reaches Cuban waters with presidential approval. Tracking data shows the tanker is carrying roughly 730,000 barrels of oil.
Nearly every one of those tankers funnels through a single stretch of ocean between Malaysia and Indonesia. At its tightest point, it narrows to under 3 kilometers across. Picture the busiest airport security line you've ever stood in, except instead of travelers, it's a quarter of the entire planet's traded oil, single file, with no other way through. Block that passage, even briefly, and the effects wouldn't take months to show up. They'd take days. Ports would back up, fuel prices would spike, and factories thousands of kilometers away, in countries that have nothing to do with the dispute, would start feeling it as their supply chains seize up. Strategists have a blunt name for this exposure, the Malacca dilemma. It isn't a new worry either. It's been on the minds of planners for decades, and the term itself dates back to warnings raised by Chinese leadership in the early 2000s. China has spent years trying to build its way around it, pipelines stretching through Central Asia, new deep-water ports along the coasts of Pakistan and Myanmar, vast underground caverns stocked with months of emergency oil, just in case. Each of these projects cost billions and took over a decade to complete, which tells you how seriously the risk has been treated at the highest levels of planning. None of it solves the actual problem, though, because at some point, that oil still has to cross an ocean. A pipeline from the coast of Pakistan only helps once the oil has already reached Pakistan by ship. A buried reserve buys you time, not independence. Eventually, the tanks run dry, and you're back to needing the sea lane open. There's a reason military planners keep coming back to this scenario in war games and policy papers. It isn't really about whether a blockade would happen tomorrow. It's about the fact that an entire economy's stability is resting on a piece of geography that belongs to nobody in that economy. A stretch of water that other navies could, in theory, close off without firing a single shot at the mainland. That kind of exposure doesn't sit well with any government, let alone one running the world's largest manufacturing base. It's the kind of vulnerability that doesn't show up in everyday headlines, precisely because nothing dramatic has to happen for it to matter. The mere possibility of disruption shapes decades of policy, trade negotiations, and military posturing, long before any ship is ever actually stopped. And it isn't just crude oil sitting in those tankers. Refined fuel, industrial feedstocks, the raw materials for fertilizer and plastics all funnel through the same corridor. A slowdown there doesn't just hit gas stations, it ripples into food supply chains and factory schedules on the other side of the planet, in countries that have never even heard of the Strait of Malacca. This single vulnerability, the fact that energy has to travel through a place someone else could choke off, is the exact thread that ties together everything else in this story. So here's the real question worth asking. What if fuel simply didn't need to travel at all? What if you could make it on-site out of ingredients that are everywhere already? That question is exactly where the first real breakthrough begins, and it starts somewhere nobody expects to find fuel. The technology rewriting aviation. Picture a factory that works something like a houseplant. It takes in sunlight, water, and gas from the atmosphere and produces something usable. Except instead of leaves and oxygen, this facility produces jet fuel. That's not a metaphor for how it feels. It's close to a literal description of the process. Step 1. Equipment pulls carbon dioxide directly out of the surrounding air. The same gas leaking out of tailpipes everywhere. Except here, it becomes a raw material instead of pollution. Step 2. Solar panels power a separate machine that splits ordinary water into oxygen and hydrogen. The oxygen is released harmlessly. The hydrogen gets kept, and it's worth remembering that word because it resurfaces in every single breakthrough still to come. It's the connective tissue running underneath this entire story. Step 3. The captured carbon dioxide is combined with that hydrogen under carefully controlled heat and pressure. The molecules rearrange themselves into a liquid fuel, and this is the part that sounds almost unbelievable. It isn't a substitute or a close enough version of jet fuel. Down to the molecular structure, it's chemically identical to what comes out of a well. An aircraft engine can't distinguish one from the other. Neither can a pilot. The only difference is where it came from. What makes this even stranger is how little the process actually needs. No drill rigs, no seismic surveys hunting for underground deposits, no wells that run dry after a few decades. Just air that's already there, water that's already there, and sunlight that shows up every single day for free. The raw materials aren't scarce or contested. They're the three most common things on the surface of this planet. Compare that to how jet fuel is normally made. Crude oil pulled out of the ground, shipped to a refinery, separated through heat into different fractions, then blended and treated before it ever reaches an airport. This process compresses that entire chain into 3 steps, none of which involve drilling, shipping crude, or refining anything extracted from underground. It's less an alternative to the oil industry's process and more a complete bypass of it. That distinction matters more than it might sound. An alternative competes with oil on price and hopes to win eventually. A bypass just makes the entire question of oil supply irrelevant to whoever's running the plant. One is a rival business model. The other quietly removes the old business model from the equation altogether. The company behind this is called Carbonology, and it opened its first facility in Shanghai's Lingang district at the start of 2026.
The Shanghai Forum, a high-level meeting that discussed changes in the international system, concluded in China,
where the Shanghai Forum 2026 has concluded this Sunday.
Right now, output is modest, around 100 tons a year, enough to prove the process works outside a laboratory setting. But the roadmap scales aggressively. 1,000-ton demonstration plant next, then 5,000 tons. With a target of 100,000 tons annually by 2027. That's enough fuel to cover thousands of long-haul flights. Scaling something like this isn't just a matter of building bigger tanks either. Every jump in output means proving the chemistry holds up at a larger scale, that the carbon capture equipment can keep pace, and that the whole system can run for months without the kind of downtime that would make it commercially useless. Going from 100 tons to 100,000 in under 2 years is an aggressive bet, not a guaranteed one. Serious money is already backing it. Sequoia China and the Yellow River Delta Investment Fund, firms that see hundreds of clean energy pitches a year, decided this particular one was worth funding. And the demand side is already lined up too. New European rules require a minimum share of aviation fuel to come from sustainable sources, a requirement that only grows through 2050. In other words, the buyers exist before the factories have even finished scaling. That's an unusual order of operations. Normally, a new energy technology has to prove it's cheap enough before customers show up. Here, the customers were locked in by regulation before the supply chain even finished being built. Airlines aren't betting on this fuel out of environmental goodwill. They're required to buy a certain percentage of it no matter what, which means whoever can produce it reliably has a captive market waiting. It's worth remembering, too, that aviation has always been one of the hardest sectors to clean up. Batteries are far too heavy to power a long-haul jet, so fuel made this way is one of the only realistic paths left for the industry. That's part of why the demand is already locked in before the supply chain has even caught up. Solving fuel is only half the puzzle, though. Making it out of air and sunlight is one thing. Having power available at the exact moment you need it is a completely different problem, and it's the one that trips up almost every renewable energy plan. The battery made from thin air. Solar and wind share the same fundamental flaw. They only generate power when the sun is out or the wind is blowing, and demand doesn't politely wait around for either. Batteries help close that gap, but even large-scale battery installations typically run out after 4 or 5 hours. That's fine for smoothing out a short dip. It's not enough to cover an entire night, a stretch of cloudy weather, or an industrial city that can't afford to slow down after dark. So engineers working in the Gobi Desert tried something almost absurdly simple. They froze the air itself. Ordinary air, cooled down to roughly -194 degrees Celsius, stops behaving like a gas and becomes a liquid. At that point, it can be pumped into storage tanks and held there indefinitely, quietly waiting. When power is needed, the liquid is allowed to warm back up. As it does, it doesn't just turn back into gas, it expands to about 750 times its liquid volume. That surge of rapidly expanding air is more than enough to drive turbines and generate electricity on demand.
The wind turbines used for this are entirely owned by the customers.
The turbine is now completed, it's generating energy.
This particular facility sits beside a 250 megawatt solar farm. During daylight hours, any extra solar output that would otherwise go unused gets redirected into freezing more air. Once night falls, that stored air converts back into electricity and keeps the grid running for roughly 10 straight hours, more than double what the strongest battery installations typically manage. To put that gap in perspective, a hospital, a data center, or a steel plant running a continuous production line can't simply pause when the sun goes down and wait for the grid to catch up. A 4-hour battery buffer covers the early evening peak, but it leaves a long stretch of night completely exposed unless it's backed up by something else, usually a gas plant burning imported fuel. 10 hours of coverage from stored air changes that math entirely because it covers most of the overnight window on its own. And it needs none of the raw materials batteries depend on. No lithium, no cobalt, none of the rare earth elements that usually have to be mined in one country, refined in another, and assembled somewhere else entirely. Just air, low temperatures, and equipment that can, in principle, be built almost anywhere. Since coming online in late 2025, the site has produced roughly 180 gigawatt hours a year. Not a pilot project anymore, but a functioning power plant. Compare that to how most grid-scale storage is built today. A large lithium battery farm typically needs materials sourced from a handful of specific countries, processed through a supply chain that can take years to secure. A liquid air plant, by contrast, is mostly steel tanks, compressors, and turbines. Technology that's been well understood in industrial engineering for decades, just never assembled quite this way. That's part of why it can be replicated quickly, in places that would otherwise have no path to reliable overnight power at all. That solves the nighttime problem for electricity. But not every machine can run purely on electricity. Ships, heavy industry, long-haul transport, these need an actual fuel they can store, move, and burn on demand. And the answer to that turns out to be something most people only associate with cleaning supplies. The chemical that could change the world. Ammonia doesn't have much of a reputation. Most people know it from household cleaners and not much else. But it has a quiet superpower. It's an efficient way to carry hydrogen from one place to another. Hydrogen, remember, burns clean. The only byproduct is water vapor. The catch is that it's brutally difficult to transport. It's the lightest element there is, which means moving useful quantities of it requires either extreme compression or extreme cold, both of which get expensive fast, especially across oceans. Ammonia sidesteps that entirely. Hydrogen atoms lock into the ammonia molecule, which behaves like an ordinary liquid, easy to ship, easy to store. And then the hydrogen can be extracted again once it reaches its destination. Think of it less like the fuel itself and more like the container that makes shipping the fuel practical. Normally, producing ammonia at scale is an energy-intensive process. The Haber-Bosch method has been the industry standard for over a century.
The main thing is with heat and pressure and maybe a catalyst, which speeds things up, you end up with a product. And here, our product is ammonia.
And it's also one of the largest single consumers of natural gas on the planet, largely because ammonia-based fertilizer feeds roughly half the world's population. It's not something the world can simply stop doing. The scale of that dependency is easy to underestimate. Entire national economies are built around access to cheap natural gas, specifically because of how much of it gets consumed, turning nitrogen into fertilizer. Any country without reliable gas supply effectively has to import its food security indirectly, through imported fertilizer. A process that removes natural gas from that equation isn't just an emissions story, it's a food security story too. But a facility in Shanxi province is now producing ammonia an entirely different way. Nitrogen pulled straight from the atmosphere, hydrogen generated from water using solar power. All of it happening at room temperature with no fossil fuel input. The plant has already run continuously for more than 50 days, staying operational over 90% of the time. Not a lab demonstration, but a working production line. The implications reach well past agriculture. Cargo ships could run on ammonia instead of heavy fuel oil, and both Japan and South Korea are already piloting ammonia-powered vessels on real shipping routes. Since roughly 90% of everything traded globally moves by sea, a shift like that would make oil optional for the shipping industry. Not cheaper, not marginal, but genuinely optional. Think about what that actually means for a sector that's historically been one of the hardest to clean up. Shipping engines are massive, they run for decades, and switching fuel types across an entire global fleet usually takes generations. But if the fuel itself is being produced domestically from sunlight and seawater rather than imported crude, the economics of switching change completely. It's no longer just an environmental upgrade, it's a way to stop paying for imported fuel altogether. Notice what's happened across these last two sections. Clean jet fuel, made from air. Power storage, made from air. Industrial ammonia, made from sunlight and seawater. 3 different technologies, and every single one of them depends on the same underlying ingredient, hydrogen. It's not just one piece of this puzzle, it's the piece connecting every other piece. Which raises an obvious question. How much hydrogen can one country actually produce, and how fast is that number climbing? In 2019, China's clean hydrogen output sat around 23,000 tons a year. By 2024, that had climbed to roughly 125,000 tons, nearly a 6-fold increase in 5 years, and still accelerating. Guangdong province alone is building an offshore wind farm specifically to power water-splitting equipment, targeting 80,000 tons of hydrogen a year from that single project, almost matching what the entire country produced just a few years earlier. Here's the part that matters even more. China now manufactures roughly 65 out of every 100 electrolyzers used worldwide, the machines that actually split water into hydrogen. Whoever builds that hardware effectively sets the pace for how fast the rest of the world can adopt this technology. A green ammonia plant in Africa, a hydrogen project in South America, a synthetic fuel initiative in Europe. Most of them start with equipment built in one country. Think about what that leverage looks like in practice. A country in South America wanting to build a green hydrogen export industry needs electrolyzers. A nation in Africa planning a green ammonia plant for fertilizer independence needs electrolyzers. A European airline chasing its synthetic fuel targets needs electrolyzers somewhere upstream in its supply chain. Almost none of that hardware is being built where it's being used. The government has formally written hydrogen into national energy law, placing it on the same tier of strategic importance as oil and gas, with billions of yuan committed as infrastructure investment rather than research funding. Even legacy oil companies are adjusting. One of the country's largest refiners saw profits fall by more than 1/3 in 2025, and rather than fight the shift, it committed roughly 800 million yuan to convert an aging fuel plant into a synthetic jet fuel facility. That's not a symbolic gesture. That's an oil company rebuilding itself around something that isn't oil. Every piece so far, the fuel, the storage, the shipping chemical, the hydrogen backbone underneath all of it, still depends on something outside anyone's control: weather. Which brings us to the one technology that could remove that limitation entirely. The power source that could change everything. Solar needs sunlight. Wind needs wind. Even the most advanced storage systems are ultimately just clever ways of working around the fact that energy supply isn't constant. You can stretch it, bank it, delay it, but you're still chasing something that comes and goes on its own schedule. So here's the obvious follow-up question. What would it take to have a power source that simply never stops? No dependence on weather, no dependence on season, no dependence on geography at all. There's only one technology on the table that could theoretically do that: fusion, the same process that powers the sun. The basic idea is to force two small atoms together under extreme heat, hotter than the sun's core, releasing an enormous burst of energy when they combine, with no harmful emissions and no long-lived waste. And the fuel for it comes from hydrogen drawn from ordinary water, which means the raw material is, quite literally, everywhere. That last point is worth pausing on. Oil sits in specific places, discovered by geology and claimed by whoever got there first. The hydrogen fusion needs is dissolved in every ocean, every lake, every river on the planet in roughly equal measure. For the first time, the fuel itself carries no geopolitical weight at all. It's not a resource anyone can corner.
In order to mitigate its fuel import bill, the country has 235 trillion cubic feet of gas reserves.
China's flagship fusion reactor, known as EAST, short for Experimental Advanced Superconducting Tokamak, is essentially a giant magnetic ring designed to hold a superheated plasma in a stable, controlled loop. This year, it set a new record for sustaining that reaction longer than any previous attempt anywhere in the world, pushing past a long-standing threshold known as the Greenwald limit, a benchmark that had been notoriously difficult to clear. Holding a reaction like this stable is closer to balancing a spinning coin on its edge than flipping a switch. Superheated plasma wants to twist, drift, and collapse out of formation within fractions of a second, and every extra moment it stays contained is the result of years of incremental engineering. Better magnets, better control systems, better prediction models for how the plasma will behave next. Clearing the Greenwald limit isn't a headline number for its own sake. It's a sign that the control problem, the part that's kept fusion a few decades away for most of the last 70 years, is genuinely being chipped down. To put the difficulty in context, plasma inside a reactor like EAST reaches temperatures many times hotter than the core of the sun itself, and no physical material on Earth could touch it directly without vaporizing instantly. The entire trick is using magnetic fields, not walls, to hold that superheated cloud in place. Invisible fences strong enough to contain something that would otherwise destroy anything it touched. Every second of stable containment is a second longer than physics has typically allowed. To be clear, fusion power is nowhere near ready to run your home or charge your phone, and it likely won't be for years. But the direction of investment and effort is unmistakable. And once you understand what fusion could eventually unlock, every earlier breakthrough in this story starts to look less like a standalone win and more like a piece of one much larger design. It also explains why a country would keep funding a technology that might not pay off for another decade or two. Fusion isn't being chased because it's the fastest win available. It's being chased because it's the only piece on the board that could eventually make every other piece unlimited. A synthetic fuel plant is only as useful as the electricity available to run its hydrogen production. A liquid air storage site is only as valuable as the surplus solar power it has to work with. Fusion is the one investment that, if it pays off, removes that ceiling from everything else at once. Think of it this way: every other breakthrough in this story is still, at some level, borrowing power from the sun and paying it back with clever engineering. Fusion is the only one that could eventually generate its own supply, on demand, without borrowing from anything. Pair an unlimited, always-on power source with everything else already in motion, and the ceiling disappears entirely. Jet fuel production could scale without limit. Hydrogen output could feed fuel plants, ammonia facilities, and power grids simultaneously, around the clock. Storage systems would stop being a stopgap and start being genuinely unnecessary, because the power feeding them would never run dry in the first place. Put all 5 pieces together, and you get something the world has never quite had before: a closed loop. Feed it air, water, and electricity. Get back fuel, industrial chemicals, fertilizer, and stored power. None of it pulled from underground, none of it dependent on a single country's coastline, and none of it vulnerable to a single narrow strip of ocean that someone else could shut down. For 100 years, power meant owning oil or controlling the route it traveled. China is quietly proving that rule doesn't have to hold, turning air into jet fuel, freezing air into electricity, running ships on a chemical from under your sink, and pushing fusion past records nobody expected to fall this soon. Put together, they form something the world has never really had: a closed loop, running on nothing but air, water, and sunlight. No oil field required, no vulnerable strait to guard. So here's the real question. If energy stops needing geography at all, which country do you think gets left behind? Drop your answer below and subscribe for what's coming next.